everybody. Dr. Matt Munger here with another episode of The Bible is Written Backwards. Today, we're going to look at the second version of the history of Israel as it's found in the Hebrew Bible. This is the second video in a series of two. The first one you can see here, and it is about the Deuteronomistic History, about the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the story they tell looking backwards from the exile at the history of Israel and what brought them to that point. Now, in this video, we're going to look at the books of Chronicles, which rewrite that history of Israel that's found in the Deuteronomistic history and bringing it into a different time and a different place. We know that Chronicles makes use of the Deuteronomistic history by the ridiculous number of parallels, and we'll look at that in this video. But the chronicler also makes the history his own, bringing it into a situation, a time, and a place that is different from the one that the Deuteronomistic history was written for. And thus, the chronicler actually is rewriting the Bible and bringing a second version of history into the Bible itself. Even a cursory reading of the book of Chronicles will show you that it is using the books of Samuel and Kings as a basis for the history of Israel. Again and again, you will see parallels between the two. But at the same time, it is different in certain ways. One of the more interesting things is that the book itself begins in a very different way than the Deuteronomistic history. It begins with genealogies, going back to Adam, and bringing the text in a way all the way from creation to the time of David. Now, it's worthwhile for us to look at the first list that shows the way the chronicler uses early material to craft his narrative. The text of 1 Chronicles 1 through 27 covers the genealogies from Adam to Abraham. Now, I'm not going to read the whole text, I'm going to put it up here, but the first line says,
Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
And what we see is that this is a list of the names of the patriarchs that we find in Genesis. It's clear that this section is not copied or derived from a single passage in Genesis, but is the result of extraction and rewriting of text throughout Genesis 1 through 11. 1 Chronicles 1 through 4 lists the names of the patriarchal line from Adam to Noah and his sons, following the genealogy of Genesis 5, where the text is more elaborate, such as we see in Genesis 5, 6 through 8 about Seth.
When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Seth lived after the birth of Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died.
Following the list of names that we see in verses 1 through 4, the chronicler inserts the table of nations, which is what we call the text that we find in Genesis chapter 10, which tells about the names of the sons of Noah, who became the leaders of the nations spread across the world. Now, this table of nations is seen to be a kind of catalog of the peoples of the known world that's been inserted into Genesis 10, which serves to show the population of the earth in the time between the flood and Abraham. Again, here, the list of 1 Chronicles is very close to the text of Genesis, but it does stray in not including certain information, especially the long list of the achievements of Nimrod that we find in Genesis 10, 9 through 12. The genealogy of Adam to Abraham is completed with the list of the patriarchs from Shem through Abraham. This, like the first section, is a summary of Genesis, this time chapter 11, verses 10 through 26. What we end up with is a highly structured list derived from material found in Genesis, but formatted entirely as a list, taking up much less space in the text, and not interspersed with narratives. The following chapters are full of similar material, some of which is extracted from earlier sources in much the same way, while other lists do not have exact parallels in the Pentateuch or other material. After the genealogy and the lists, the story moves directly to the death of Saul and the anointing of David that parallels texts found in 1 Samuel. From here to nearly the end of 2 Chronicles, the author of Chronicles, usually called the chronicler, follows the outline of the Deuteronomistic history as a base, at times repeating text word for word, at times making subtle changes, and at times including completely different materials that we don't know from other sources. One thing that is for sure is that the chronicler used Samuel and Kings in some form as sources. Here's an example from 1 Chronicles 11 on the anointing of David that closely parallels 2 Samuel 5. The text that is being read is the Chronicles version, but I've put both of them on the screen so you can compare.
Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "See, we are your bone and flesh. For some time now, even while Saul was king, it was you who commanded the army of Israel. The Lord your God said to you, 'It is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel, you who shall be ruler over my people Israel.'" So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel.
We can see some small grammatical and lexical differences between these two texts, but on the whole, it's clear that they are directly related to each other. These parallels are found throughout Chronicles, and scholars tend to see the differences between Chronicles and the Deuteronomistic history as a source of information about the historiographical concerns of the chronicler. Scholarship today tends to point out that the chronicler was creating something new, not just simply reparsing or rewriting the Deuteronomistic history. The result is a text that uses Israel's history as laid out in the Deuteronomistic history to speak to a new context. Now, as I noted above, scholars generally agree that that Chronicles is written from the perspective of later inhabitants of the land of Israel, probably in Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. This is evident both in the concerns of the book and the fact that the text ends with the return of the captives from exile, and it also includes a list of the post-exilic genealogies in the beginning section of the book. So the date of the composition of Chronicles is sometime after 538 BCE, when the captives were freed. The text must have been more or less completed by the 1st century BCE, when the earliest extant manuscripts are found. So the text is probably from the 300s sometime, but a later date can't be completely ruled out. Now, where the contents of Chronicles do differ from the Deuteronomistic history, they have some clear tendencies. First of all, the story is centered around David and Solomon, with much less space for the other kings and figures. The good kings Hezekiah and Josiah are also given ample space in Chronicles. Second, the worship in the temple is presented in a different way, with the roles of the priests and the Levites much more in focus. The word Levite, in singular or plural, is used 4 times in the books of Samuel and Kings combined, whereas in 1st and 2nd Chronicles it's used 113 times. This shows a different focus on the roles and practices of the temple and points to a community concerned with these topics. So the focus turns the story away from the people as subject of kings and reorients them to being a community that worships God. So let's look at a comparison of 2 Samuel 6, 12 through 15, and 1 Chronicles 15. Again, the text that's being read is the 1 Chronicles version, and we have both versions on the screen.
David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David commanded that no one but the Levites were to carry the ark of God, for the Lord had chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. Then David gathered together the descendants of Aaron and the Levites. So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of the thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing. And because God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, as also were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and the singers, and Chenaniah, the leader of the music of the singers. And David wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, to the sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, and made loud music on harps and lyres.
The basic outline of the text from 2 Samuel is still discernible in the Chronicles text, but there are a number of differences. The most visible is the long list of Levites and priests, that I omitted from the text here that are included in the Chronicles text. This is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it shows the focus on the Levites and priests in Chronicles, which is clearly lacking in the 2 Samuel text. Second, the motives and actions of David are adjusted in Chronicles to fall in line with certain theological concerns. In Samuel, David could be seen as acting out of jealousy, or acting just to get the blessings that come from the Ark of the Covenant being kept in the house of Obed Edom. In Chronicles, however, David is proactive, preparing a place for the ark, pitching a tent for it. In addition to this, in the Samuel text, David is portrayed as sacrificing an ox and a fatling, which certainly does not fit with the temple regulations that only allow Levites and priests to take part in some temple ceremonies. So, in the cleaner Chronicles text, we find this problem fixed, with the Levites and priests being introduced into the story to do the proper sacrificing. The redrafting of David's motivation and sacrifice in 1 Chronicles 15 is just one of many examples of the reframing of the actions of the kings, especially David and Solomon, in the book of Chronicles. The idealizing of the kings is primarily done through a process of omitting the stories from Samuel and Kings in the comparison of and the composition of Chronicles. But there are also stories that are adapted and transformed. This happens both in the rewriting of episodes that might negatively affect the image of David or Solomon, but also through the omission of some of the worst episodes. These include the narratives of David and Saul that are found in 1 Samuel, where David performs a number of shady deeds, including joining the Philistines in their battles against Israel, 1 Samuel 29 to 31. This is probably omitted because the picture that is painted of David as a rebel and even enemy of Israel in the time before he becomes king is problematic. David's improper relationship with Bathsheba and subsequent liquidation of her husband Uriah, found in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, is not repeated or even mentioned in Chronicles either, probably also an attempt to erase one of the more problematic episodes of David's kingship. Another story that doesn't make it into the chronicler's retelling of Israel's history is the story of the rape of Tamar by her brother Amnon and the revenge taken out by their brother Absalom, also found in 2 Samuel. All of these stories have in common that they portray David and his house in extremely negative light, to the point that one may question David's legitimacy or abilities as king. It seems that one of the major concerns of the chronicler was to present a more optimistic view of the royal house and keep David in high esteem and in line with the covenant with God. A final example of the way the chronicler is different from the Deuteronomistic history is in the end. The chronicler continues history beyond the final episodes of 2 Kings and presents something else, namely the freeing of the captives by Cyrus. We know that Chronicles was produced in the post-exilic period, which often is called the Persian period in scholarship. We know this for two very specific reasons. First of all, as mentioned, the end of Chronicles accounts the end of the exile and the freeing of the Judeans from captivity. Now, some scholars will point out that this may be just a secondary addition to the text and not part of the original form of Chronicles, but still, in the form we have it, the text clearly knows about the freeing of the slaves and portrays this as part of the story. Second, we have lists of the inhabitants of Jerusalem after the exile in 1 Chronicles 9. So let's look at both of these texts. The end of the Deuteronomistic history in 2 Kings is the release of King Jehoiakim from captivity in Babylon, but there is no indication that the story continues anywhere other than in Babylon. Chronicles, however, ends on a different note, with the announcement by Cyrus of the end of the Babylonian captivity. So 1 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23 reads,
In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also declared in a written edict, Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, let him go up.
This can be taken as a firm point of departure for dating the final version of Chronicles, and for making sense of the historical setting of the writing of the text. It comes after the release of the people from Babylon, and just how long after is a very different question. We do get some clues about this at the beginning of the book, in First Chronicles chapter 9, which begins with a summary statement of the preceding and actually of the whole of the Deuteronomistic history, followed by a title for the lists that follow. So First Chronicles 9, 1 to 2 says,
So all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now the first to live again in their possessions in their towns were Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants.
most of First Chronicles 9 is then made up of lists of three groups of people: the regular inhabitants of Jerusalem after the exile, the priests, and the Levites. First Chronicles 9, 3 through 9 includes a list of the inhabitants of Jerusalem after the exile, where First Chronicles 9, 10 through 13 has a list of the priests, and 9, 14 to 34 has a list of the Levites and their duties in post-exile Jerusalem. In other words, we can be very certain that the final edition of the Book of Chronicles was finalized well after the exile. Over the past few decades, scholars have focused on the fact that Chronicles is a new history, not just a rehashing of the Deuteronomistic history. But what was the purpose of this retelling? I think Simon de Vries summarizes the differences quite well in saying,
Israel is now the worshipping congregation, Kahal. The ark, temple site, and temple are put in place according to the Samuel Kings sequence. The priests, Levites, and other orders receive their directions, and, finally, the festivals are ordained as if for eternity. It is fair to say, then, that while the Deuteronomistic history is Israel's history, Chronicles is intended as God's history. Also, it is clear that Chronicles is writing the story not of a nation, but of a congregation.
the overarching historiographical principle of the chronicler seems to be a sacred history, not a political or national history like we found in the Deuteronomistic history. David, as a leader in the Deuteronomistic history, is allowed to live an adventurous, adulterous life. But in Chronicles, he's painted as establishing the worship of God and as a role model as such. This makes sense if we consider Chronicles as a product of some time well after the exile, maybe in the 4th or 3rd century BCE, when Jerusalem was growing and the consolidation of the worship of God in the temple in Jerusalem had progressed. The chronicler clearly has not only the Deuteronomistic history at his disposal, but also other sources similar to what we know from the Pentateuch, crafting a national sacred history that paints the eternal importance of the worship of God in the institution of the temple. In this way, the chronicler is using and rewriting not only the history of Israel, but also a lot of what became the scriptures of Israel. And that makes it another prime example of the Bible being written backwards.